Hello, my name is Vincent Neiman, and this is Orthodox Christian Television. Our guest today is Mr. Michael Halfert, who is a screenwriter and a novelist as well, and he's going to review a book which he heard plugged on a local radio station by the author. The author is Professor Michael A. Sells, and the book is The Bridge Betrayed, Religion and Genocide in Bosnia. Welcome, Mr. Halfert. Now, what caught your attention about this book, or could you sum up or give us the crux of the argument of the author?
Well, basically, the argument is a religious argument concerning the Bosnian War. Mm-hmm. He tries to simplify the Bosnian War to simply an explanation based upon religious motivations. And he says the crux of the argument of the book is that the Bosnian Muslims are victims of a genocide committed by the Bosnian Serbs in the name of a religious passion. No. And that this religious passion is an acting out this kind of medieval passion play by which these Christ-killing infidels will be purged from the sacred Christian soil.
So they're sort of recreating this medieval event or passion play or whatever.
That's correct.
I see. So, well, overall, what are your general impressions of the book?
Well, from an Orthodox perspective, I didn't find much of the book convincing or compelling.
And why?
Like most people that are ignorant of that part of the world, he chose to take one side of an argument, one side of a story, and present that side, and he didn't take the full encompassing argument. Mm-hmm. It means he didn't look at all of the facts or take all of the sides. Mm-hmm. It means it was as if he had a preconceived notion of what he was going to find and how he was going to prove it, and almost like a legal argument of a prosecutor set out to find and mass evidence to prove his case.
I see. And his case was for whom?
Was for the Bosnian Muslims as victims and the Serbs as genocidal, Nazi-like attackers or perpetrators.
So, well, what would you say is his a general argument of this book? And, well, actually, could you say that his central argument is a very convincing one?
It's convincing from one point of view. That means if you only take what certain Bosnian Muslims have said, mm-hmm. and yet you don't take into account any of the Serb arguments or any of the arguments from the other side, then one could paint a very convincing case. Mm-hmm. It means if the average American who's ignorant of most of the facts picked this book up and sat down and read it, mm-hmm. they might be convinced that this is a simple and concise explanation as to the causes of the war.
Much like the media impressions that we've received of the war.
And the difference between this and the average media impression is that this is a more scholarly work, well footnoted, mm-hmm. and but it essentially says the same story that the media has said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is really sort of painting a black and white picture of this situation over there. There's no variables or gray matter in between.
That's correct. And ultimately, it's not, from an Orthodox perspective, it's not satisfying because it doesn't take into account all of the facts, mm-hmm. all of the information. Mm-hmm. And it essentially tries to vilify all Orthodox people as being co-conspirators, willing to condone the rape and murder and pillaging of whole people, mm-hmm. the eradication of an endemic Bosnian culture.
Sort of an oversimplification of what's really going on over there. Logically, it's overly simplified in making a good guy and a bad guy, as it were.
Well, it's almost like a cowboy story, like the typical American story,
mm-hmm.
where you spend a significant amount of time learning who the bad guy is and who the good guy is, and you end up rooting for the good guy and waiting to see the bad guy get it in the end. Mm-hmm. And he, in the radio program in particular, not so much in the book, but in the radio program, he acted as a cheering section, saying that we didn't go far enough, we weren't
Who is we?
We, the NATO, the Americans, that in our response to the war, that we should have recognized the Serbs early on as the terrible racist and Nazi-like persecutors that they were, and had sufficient moral will.
Or as they were painted that they were.
Yes, and had sufficient moral will to attack them with the force necessary to stop this genocide.
I see. So he's gone even further to the right, politically speaking, by saying that we should have gone in there right away.
Well, he essentially takes up the argument that most of the right wing in the country had taken up, that the arms embargo should have been lifted early, that there should have been repeated punitive NATO airstrikes, and that the only way to deal with this essentially religious cancer, which was basically, in his mind, a kind of irrational setting right, the wrongs committed under the Muslim domination. Trying to recapture the glory of what was once the Serbian Empire, the Serbian, pure Serbian race, before the Ottoman rule came in. And the Battle of Kosovo, plays a central part in his argument. The famous battle in 1369 that is part of Serb history, in which Prince Lazar was sacrificed himself and the Bosnian country to the to the Muslims as they conquered the territory. And he tries to argue, and I don't think effectively, that the major problem with the Serbian war was this sense that the Bosnian reenactment of this Battle of Kosovo was occurring with the Bosnian War.
I see. So people who might have been neighbors and these issues which might not have come up a couple of years before, suddenly their relationships changed because of the anniversary of Kosovo.
Yes.
The reenactment of that.
Well, it begins with this complex argument about how in 1989 they had the 600-year anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, and forces were let loose in that reenactment because there was a large participation of many, many Serbian people in that, and that this stimulated growing religious fervor. And in fact, then that the Bosnian leadership, including Milosevic and Karadzic and Mladic, were able to tap into this anti-Muslim hysteria and direct it towards a genocide of the Muslim people. And that the only thing that could inspire neighbor to kill neighbor was this kind of religious hysteria. And he was arguing that this was propagated by religious figures within the church. And that this is somehow endemic to Serbian Orthodox understanding of what it means to be an Orthodox Christian, that somehow we have that they had a responsibility to overcome the Muslim and to eradicate it and to purge the Christian land of the infidel Muslim.
By whatever means necessary.
Yes.
And in other words, they're pinning all of these war crimes and atrocities besides on the Serbian or Bosnian Serbian leaders, also pointing the finger of guilt at the hierarchs of the Serbian Orthodox Church, right?
And it's hard to know because he quotes a number of Orthodox people and a number of Orthodox leaders in the book, and there's no way that we can independently verify these quotations. But he tries to imply that these are dogmas of the Orthodox Church, and that it is a position of the Orthodox Church that it can literally condones the killing of Muslims and the rape of Muslims based upon the fact that they're Christ killers.
And there's this destruction of their mosques and their culture, essentially.
And first of all, we have no evidence that the Orthodox people in Serbia were any more fervent prior to the war. They were any more fervent after the war than they were prior. or that there was some huge religious revival which would have produced this religious sentiment, because after all, Tito kept a tight rein on religious observance throughout his entire nearly 50-year rule.
And as many communist rulers do, because they're atheists, essentially.
And, it's hard to say. I have had conversations with Serbian people who said that there was not a widespread religious fervor in Serbia prior to the war. That in response to the war, many Serbians have gone back to church and have been rebaptized, and there wasn't a widespread practice of baptism within the Serbian community prior to the war.
I see.
So it's, for a Western mind, it seems very simple to break things down into a kind of religious story, a kind of Christian holy war, as he began, his discussion on the radio. But I think that's oversimplistic. I think that there are far more complex things going on, issues of economic inequality, issues of unredressed grievances from World War II, which have nothing to do with religion, which prompted this conflict. And though, however satisfying it may be to discuss this as somehow an anti-Orthodox polemic, saying that we have to be concerned wherever Orthodox live that this might erupt again, I think that ultimately it's not a convincing argument. Because it is not a position of the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church does not condone genocide. It does not condone the murder of innocents. It does not condone rape. It does not condone
forced conversion. Right. Or any of these things that they seem to be accused of, well, as far as the Western media goes.
And in fact, one of the interesting things in the book is how pro-Muslim he appears to be.
So the book really seems to be a one-sided approach to the whole situation over there.
I mean, he's a professor of religion at Haverford College, and I think he's the dean of the religious studies department there. And yet, he begins, here's like a quote from the book. The final mythic figure of Croatian and Serbian religious nationalism is the evil Ottoman. No occupied nation thinks kindly of its colonizer, and the Ottomans were no doubt capable of cruelty and oppression, yet the stories of Ottoman depravity at the heart of nationalist mythology cannot match the evidence. If, as Croatian and Serbian religious leaders and academics claim, the Ottomans were constantly massacring Christians, how is it that such large groups of Catholics and Orthodox Christians not only survived, but in some cases grew and flourished under Ottoman rule? If, as today's national myths would maintain, the Ottomans spent 500 years busily eradicating all traces of Christianity, how is it that such a magnificent ancient heritage of Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, manuscripts, art, and architecture survived Ottoman rule as well? So his central argument was that the Orthodox, basically, when they talk about the oppression that the Muslims inflicted upon them during 400 years of occupation, that there are exaggerations. That, in fact, the Muslims have been historically tolerant of Christian religions and anyone that has studied history knows that, yes, there were periods of tolerance and there were periods of in which there were benevolent Ottoman rulers, but as a general rule, Islamic countries have not been tolerant of Christian diversity.
Christians are the infidel.
I mean, look at any Muslim country today and ask yourself honestly, is there religious tolerance for Christianity? And I don't think anyone honestly would say that the Muslims have a long history of tolerance for other religions. Yet he attempts to paint a picture of Orthodox as even more intolerant than the Muslims.
When the Muslims have had a history of forced conversions and torture and various massacres taking over Christian churches in the Mideast and turning them into mosques and sometimes massacring large numbers of people, so like the Armenians and the Greeks and particularly in this century, even. So, yeah, it doesn't sound like a terribly convincing argument if you've
well, it's not a convincing
received
argument.
other information. Yes.
I mean, if your knowledge of that part of the world, which most people's knowledge of that part of the world is limited, if the only knowledge you have of that part of the world is what you read in this book, it would sound compelling. If all you read was the New York Times and all you heard was what the American media tell you about the Bosnian War, it's easy to come to the conclusion that this is a one-sided conflict in which the Muslims were primarily the victims and the Serbs were primarily the...
So this is a book is sort of a companion to the media onslaught that the American people have been subjected to.
And and that's not to say that there haven't been atrocities committed by the Serbs. Certainly there have.
Of course.
And it's not to say that there haven't been massacres and there haven't been other things, because we can't, not being there, independently verify that these things did not occur. But it's one thing to look at individual acts committed by certain individuals and say that these acts are heinous and these acts are worthy of prosecution. But it's another to indict a whole people and say that the acts of a people are representative of their religious viewpoint, their religious perspective. And I think that this is what this book tries to argue, that somehow there is something militantly intolerant about the Orthodox Church, and that it has to be watched, it has to be suspected, it has to be
monitored and sort of to have a strike force ready to keep it in check anytime necessary.
And that's, it's like the Army, and he's very angry that the Western powers, the NATO powers, the French, the British, seem to be sympathetic to the Serbian position.
So, well, it seems to me that they have been, especially in response to the Breadline massacres in Sarajevo and the Marketplace massacre, where the UN forensic specialist from France and England concluded that an incoming shell couldn't have killed that many people, and the trajectory and all of this, the information that they had and that they found, it made these things impossible. And it's like you said, it's a rather one-sided approach, this book is, and but if that's all the information you have, you would tend to believe it.
And another one of the central, he spends a whole chapter discussing the complicity of Western Christians in the genocide of the Serbian Muslims.
Has he mentioned the Croats in there?
Yes, though he doesn't concentrate that much on the Croats, which is another one of the surprising things about the book. He does discuss some of them, the atrocities committed by the Croats against the Muslims. And in fact, some of the most vicious fighting during the war was between the Croatian Bosnians and the Croatian Muslims. In fact, but that seems to be dealt with, kind of superficially in this treaty.
Now, there are many people who say that it's an ethnic war. What does he talk about that at all? The ethnicity of the groups as a contributing factor to the conflict?
Well, he acknowledges, as most commentators do not, that there is no ethnically Bosnian Muslim, there is no ethnically Croatian, there is no ethnic Serb, that in fact these are the same people speaking the same language. There are primarily religious differences between them. Of course, he acknowledges that the Croatians use the Latin alphabet, the Serbians use the Cyrillic alphabet, and the Muslims use either the Latin or sometimes they even use the Arabic alphabet. He makes those kinds of distinctions, but he essentially says that the argument that there is only one people, one language, and what separates them is not race or ethnicity, but cultural differences based upon religion. So he reduces the entire conflict to one of differences over religion.
I see. Well, could you elaborate on this, the Orthodox exposition of sin? Because he must seem that it's quite different than what it is, since, according to him, horrible atrocities are condoned by Orthodox hierarchs and clergy and so forth.
This is one of the most unusual things about the book. It's Western philosophical and religious thinkers, especially in the post-Christian, Western world, try to reduce sin to some kind of rational and coherent motivation. They try to come up with some rational reason why people commit heinous acts. Whereas the Orthodox view of sin is that ultimately you can deal with the questions of atrocities and of rape in the absence of a Christian understanding of the world. Mm-hmm. You have to deal with redemption, with Christ, with the notion of fallen humanity.
You need those reference points in order for that viewpoint to work. In other words.
And what is appealing to most Western minds about explanations such as this is that they provide a rational and logical explanation for human behavior. Mm-hmm. Something that people can get a handle on, that they can understand simply.
Mm-hmm. Not allowing for all of the variables of, just in human nature and in our differences in personality, even of people who believe the same way ideologically. All right.
And and I think that ultimately is one of the most unsatisfying aspects of the book, is the feeling that you can reduce human behavior to an ideology. That you can say that all that motivates the people to commit whatever act is their ideology. That there aren't other complex, irrational factors which produce certain behaviors. That the only plausible explanation for why a neighbor will kill neighbor is ideology.
Yeah.
Or as he would couch it, fundamentalism.
Yeah.
Because a number of times in the book he equates Islamic fundamentalism, the kind of fundamentalism which produced the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, and the kind of genocide being committed by the Bosnian Serbs, as a kind of ideological fundamentalism.
Orthodox Christians couldn't help but look at that and think, what is wrong with this picture, right?
Yeah.
So...
And that the crux of his argument is that this kind of dogmatic belief in absolute right or absolute wrong always produces violence.
Well, it might produce violence, but not quite because of the motivations stated in his book.
And that because the Serbs were motivated by these myths, as he calls them, these myths of the Battle of Kosovo, these myths of the persecutions under the Ottoman Turks, these myths of Turkish harems, and he weaves an elaborate argument as to the power of these myths demonizing the Muslims. Because the Serbians were so convinced of these myths, they were able to act in totally demonic almost ways.
Sort of overnight, he's saying that
this occurred,
a country that was run by communists or a communist leader and where religion was suppressed, people could just sort of flip over and make this a holy war.
Yes.
That's remarkable.
But it sounds convincing, because in the press we have these very elaborate arguments for how all Muslims are terrorists. Mm-hmm. So, think of after the Oklahoma City bombing, the first place they looked was for Muslims.
Of course. And it's not really, or it shouldn't be, an indictment of Muslims as a blanket approach to, or judgment of this is how Muslims are everywhere. But that is the approach that the media takes and which the American people seem to buy, wouldn't you say?
Yes, because they like simple stories.
Right. Okay.
They like knowing who the bad guy is, who the good guy is, and being able to judge between them. In a world of moral ambiguity, where even you and I commit sins, in such a world, one cannot judge.
Bingo.
And that's the problem, is that we as human beings want to judge. We want to know. We want to know these are good people, these are bad people. These are people with which we can have an association, and these are people we can shun. And by understanding who is good, who is bad, who is evil, who is a saint, then we can come to an understanding of where we fit in.
And that sounds like what he has done in his book.
Yes.
Correct. Well, I must thank you, Mr. Halford, for coming and illuminating what Professor Sells has done in his book, The Bridge Betrayed, Religion and Genocide in Bosnia. Thank you very much for being our guest.